Lola had always dreamed of attending one of Lagos's prestigious high schools, but as the daughter of a school teacher and a seamstress, such dreams seemed far out of reach. Her family lived modestly, with little to spare for luxuries like expensive school fees or extracurricular activities. But Lola's determination was unwavering. She had always been the brightest student in her class, earning the admiration of her teachers and the respect of her peers. When a scholarship announcement came, Lola hardly believed it at first. A full scholarship to one of the most elite schools in the city, St. Thomas Academy. It felt like a dream. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, and now, it seemed the universe was rewarding her for her dedication. The letter, signed by the principal, congratulated her and promised a place among the best and brightest students. Her parents, overwhelmed with pride and disbelief, celebrated the news in their own way. Her mother wept silently, a mix of joy and sorrow on her face. While she was thrilled for her daughter's success, she knew it meant Lola would be leaving their small home in the suburbs to join the upper class in the heart of Lagos. It was a dream come true, but also a reminder of the worlds that would separate them. At the same time, Lola couldn't help but feel a pang of fear. The school was known for its wealth and exclusivity. Most of the students were the children of Lagos's elite, wealthy families who had everything at their disposal. What would Lola, a scholarship student from a humble background, look like amidst them? The thought of standing out for being different was both thrilling and terrifying. Nonetheless, Lola packed her things, her heart swelling with excitement and anxiety. She was going to make the most of this opportunity. She was determined to prove that she belonged, no matter her background. As the car pulled away from her modest home, Lola took one last look at her neighborhood. She knew things would never be the same again. Lola's heart raced as she approached the gates of St. Thomas Academy. The towering school buildings were nothing like the small, rundown classrooms she was used to. The campus was a sprawling estate with manicured lawns, tennis courts, and a grand, old stone structure that radiated an air of privilege and wealth. The students walking past her were immaculately dressed in their expensive uniforms, their heads held high, as though the world had already been handed to them. As Lola walked toward the main building, she could feel the stares. Some students whispered behind their hands, casting glances her way, noticing her worn shoes and the slightly outdated school uniform she had been given as part of the scholarship. Her heart thudded in her chest, and she could hear her own thoughts racing, wondering if she had made the right choice by coming here. Her first class was chemistry. When she entered, the room fell silent for a brief moment. Every pair of eyes was on her, some curious, others filled with judgment. She could feel the weight of their gaze. The teacher, Mr. Olamide, a man with perfectly combed hair and a precise, commanding tone, greeted her with a warm smile. "Ah, you must be Lola, our new scholarship student," he said. The emphasis on scholarship made Lola's skin prickle. "We're glad to have you." The students' whispers began again. Lola could hear the buzz of conversation from the back of the room, though she couldn't quite make out the words. It didn't matter. She focused on her desk, trying to ignore the discomfort she felt in her chest. Just as she was beginning to settle in, a voice interrupted her thoughts. "You must be the new girl," a smooth, confident voice said. Lola looked up, startled. A boy with messy dark hair and an air of quiet confidence stood in front of her, a subtle smirk on his face. His uniform was immaculate, as though he belonged to the very fabric of the school. His name was David, she learned later, and he was known for being the heir to one of the city's largest tech empires. Despite his wealth and the rumors about him being a bit of a loner, Lola couldn't help but notice something magnetic about him. David leaned against the desk casually, his piercing eyes studying her. "I've heard about you," he said cryptically. "I'm sure you'll do just fine here." Lola's heart fluttered, unsure whether his words were an offer of encouragement or veiled mockery. She opened her textbook and tried to focus on the lesson, but his presence lingered in her mind. Lola couldn't stop thinking about David after their first encounter in chemistry class. There was something enigmatic about him, something that made him stand out from the other students. He wasn't like the others who flaunted their wealth openly or tried to assert their status. Instead, David carried himself with an aloofness, a calm, almost indifferent air that seemed to draw people in rather than push them away. Over the next few days, Lola kept a watchful eye on him, noticing how he moved through the school with effortless grace. He rarely interacted with others, preferring to keep to himself. The few times he did speak to anyone, his words were sharp, measured, and often cryptic, leaving others wondering what he truly meant. No one seemed to understand him completely, and Lola found herself intrigued by this boy who seemed so unreachable, so different from everyone else. One afternoon, after school, Lola found herself in the library, desperately trying to catch up on her reading. She had a test coming up, and though she was always at the top of her class, the pressure of being in such an elite school made her feel like she had to work even harder. As she flipped through the pages, a shadow fell across her desk. She looked up to see David standing there, his eyes meeting hers with a look that was both curious and knowing. "You're studying again?" he asked, his tone teasing but not unkind. Lola nodded, feeling a bit self-conscious. "I have to. I can't afford to slip up." David's gaze softened for a moment. "You don't need to prove anything to anyone here, you know." Lola blinked in surprise. "I don't know what you mean." He shrugged, looking at the books on her desk. "Everyone thinks they're so much better than you, don't they?" His voice was quiet, but there was an intensity behind it that made Lola's heart race. Before she could respond, David turned and walked away, leaving her sitting there, caught between confusion and curiosity. His words lingered in her mind as she continued her studies, but now she couldn't help but wonder if there was more to David than just the wealthy, misunderstood heir. The next day, Lola's curiosity got the better of her. She decided to approach David, though she wasn't sure what she would say. As luck would have it, he was standing alone near the school's garden, his face buried in his phone. She walked up cautiously, her heart thumping in her chest. "David," she said softly. He looked up, surprised, but his face quickly transformed into his usual guarded expression. "Lola, right?" he said, his voice neutral. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of hesitation. David studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I don't bite." As they walked toward a quiet corner of the school grounds, Lola couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to discover something she wasn't sure she was ready for. Lola had never been one to seek out gossip, but there was something about David's presence that stirred a curiosity within her. He was like an enigma, a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. She needed to know more. As they sat in the quiet corner of the school garden, Lola glanced over at David, who was leaning casually against a stone bench, his eyes scanning the horizon. "I don't understand you," Lola said, her voice almost a whisper. "You don't seem like the others. You don't try to impress anyone. You don't care about the school's reputation or anything like that." David smiled, though it was brief and didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not about impressing people. It's about not caring what they think. People here are obsessed with status and money. They spend all their time trying to climb a ladder that's never going to get them anywhere meaningful. I'd rather not be part of that." Lola felt a sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't alone in her feelings of being out of place. But then, David's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "Why do you care, though?" he asked, his tone softer now. "You don't seem like you belong here, either." Lola's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure how to answer. It wasn't something she had openly acknowledged, even to herself. But here, in front of David, the words felt like they were ready to spill out. I didn't come from money or privilege. My family." She hesitated, unsure of how much she wanted to reveal. "We're just regular people. My parents worked hard to get me here. I have to prove that I deserve this opportunity. I can't fail." David looked at her, his expression softening. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," he said quietly. "You've already earned your place. The scholarship wasn't handed to you. You worked for it." Lola wasn't sure how to respond. She had never really allowed herself to feel that way. But as David spoke, she realized that he was right. She had earned this spot, and maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to carry the weight of everyone's expectations. David's gaze shifted, his eyes clouding with something Lola couldn't quite read. "You know," he said, his voice lower now, "sometimes it's not just about being smart or working hard. Sometimes it's about knowing the right people. And I've learned the hard way that the more you try to play by the rules, the more the rules get bent around you." Lola frowned, not quite understanding what he meant. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. David hesitated before answering, his voice almost a murmur. "My family. My father. He's made deals I wish I could unmake. I've been pushed into a world that I never wanted. They want me to take over his empire, to follow in his footsteps, but I don't want any part of it." Lola felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to him speak. David wasn't just a misunderstood rich kid. He was carrying the weight of his family's expectations and the burden of their secrets. He wasn't the carefree, rebellious heir everyone assumed he was. There was a lot more beneath the surface. David stood up abruptly, cutting the conversation short. "I should go," he said, his voice tight. "But just remember this, Lola. Sometimes it's better to let go of things that aren't your fight. Don't get caught in other people's messes." Lola watched as he walked away, her thoughts swirling. She had just gotten a glimpse into David's world, a world of power, secrets, and expectations, and it wasn't the glamorous life everyone assumed. It was complicated, messy, and far more difficult than she had imagined. But as she sat there, pondering the conversation, one thing was clear. David wasn't just some rich kid. He was someone struggling to find his place in a world that demanded he be something he didn't want to be. And somehow, in that moment, Lola felt a deeper connection to him than ever before. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for Lola. David's cryptic words had lingered in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to him than he let on. Every time she saw him at school, he seemed even more distant, lost in his own world, consumed by thoughts that Lola couldn't begin to understand. He would pass her in the hallways, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite grasp, but he never said anything more about what he had shared with her in the garden. Lola threw herself into her studies, trying to focus on her textbooks and assignments, but she couldn't stop thinking about David. His words echoed in her mind, reminding her that sometimes the most perfect facades were hiding the darkest truths. She had known that life was never as simple as it appeared, but now she realized just how much more complicated David's life was than she could have imagined. One afternoon, as Lola sat in the library, poring over her history notes, she overheard a conversation between two girls seated at a nearby table. They were gossiping, as teenage girls often did, but what caught Lola's attention was the name that came up. "Did you hear about David?" One of the girls whispered, her voice tinged with excitement. The other girl leaned in closer. "What about him?" "They say his family's empire is on the verge of collapse. His father's business dealings have attracted some unsavory attention. I heard rumors that David might have to take over sooner than he thinks. Poor guy. He doesn't even want to run the company. He hates everything his father stands for." Lola's heart skipped a beat. So, David's words weren't just a passing comment. They were rooted in something real, something that had the power to change his life, and perhaps the lives of everyone around him. Lola sat frozen in her seat, trying to digest what she had just heard. The boy who appeared so aloof, so out of place in the world of high society, was facing a battle that no one could truly comprehend. His family's empire, which seemed so perfect from the outside, was built on secrets and unstable ground. Suddenly, Lola felt a surge of empathy for him. She had always believed that the rich had it easy, that their lives were filled with luxury and opportunities. But now, she saw the cracks in the illusion. David wasn't just another privileged teenager with a carefree life. He was a person burdened by the weight of his family's expectations, struggling with a future that had already been written for him, even though he didn't want it. The thought of him being forced into a role he despised filled Lola with a deep sadness. She had seen that same struggle in her own family, how her parents had worked hard to make sure she had a chance at a better life, but always at the cost of their own happiness. Lola didn't want to end up trapped in a life she hadn't chosen, but it seemed like that was the fate waiting for David. As the bell rang, signaling the end of school for the day, Lola gathered her things and left the library. Her mind was spinning, but she knew one thing for sure. She needed to talk to David. She needed to understand more about what he was going through, about the life he was being forced into. But the question remained, would he let her in, or would he continue to shut everyone out? The following week, Lola found herself thinking about David more than she expected. The whispers in the library had sparked something in her, a need to understand him, to know why he seemed so distant and detached from everything around him. Every time their paths crossed in the hallways or during class, Lola couldn't help but feel a tug of curiosity. What was it about him that made her want to reach out to break through the cold, unapproachable facade he had built around himself? One afternoon, as she was heading to the school's courtyard to take a break, Lola spotted David sitting by the fountain. He was alone, staring into the water, his posture tense as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. The sight of him like that, vulnerable, quiet, and seemingly lost, pulled at her heart. It was the first time she had seen him like this, without the mask of confidence and indifference he usually wore. For a moment, Lola hesitated. Should she approach him? Should she try to talk to him again? Her heart was torn between the desire to help him and the fear of making things worse. But something inside her told her that this was her chance to finally understand the boy who had captured her attention in so many ways. Taking a deep breath, Lola walked toward him. "David," she called softly, her voice tentative. He looked up, startled for a moment, before his expression softened into a familiar, guarded look. "Lola, didn't see you there," he replied, his tone neutral, but with a faint hint of something, an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Is everything okay?" Lola asked, sitting beside him on the stone bench that surrounded the fountain. She kept a safe distance, not wanting to intrude too much, but wanting to offer him a sense of comfort. David sighed, looking away. "Yeah, just thinking." He paused before adding, "About everything." Lola watched him carefully, sensing that there was more he wasn't saying. She didn't push him, knowing that he wouldn't open up if she was too forceful. But her curiosity and empathy drove her to try again. "You don't have to tell me everything, David, but I know you're carrying a lot. I just want you to know that you don't have to do it alone." David let out a quiet laugh, but it wasn't one of amusement. It was bitter, tinged with years of frustration. "You don't get it, Lola. You don't know what it's like. I'm not like you. I didn't choose this life, but it's been handed to me. My family, they expect me to take over the business, to fix everything. They think I can save them." Lola's heart ached as she listened to him speak. She had always thought that wealth and privilege came with all the answers, but David's words shattered that illusion. He was trapped in a world that wasn't his, a world where his every move was dictated by the legacy of his family. The empire his father had built was more of a prison than a privilege. "You don't have to save anyone, David," Lola said gently. "You don't owe anyone anything." David's eyes met hers then, and for the first time, Lola saw a crack in his armor. There was a raw vulnerability there, a glimpse of the pain he had been hiding for so long. But before he could respond, a voice interrupted them from across the courtyard. "David, there you are." A girl approached them, her voice laced with a sense of urgency. It was Clara, one of the popular girls from their class, known for her bubbly personality and her close ties to the school's elite crowd. David quickly straightened up, his posture becoming stiff as he turned to face her. "What is it?" he asked, his tone distant once again. Clara smiled brightly, but there was an underlying tension in her expression. "Your father wants to see you. He's waiting for you at the office. He says it's important." David nodded curtly. "I'll be right there." As Clara walked away, Lola noticed how quickly David's walls went back up. He turned to her with a faint, almost apologetic smile. "I guess I should go. Duty calls." Lola watched him stand and walk away, the heaviness of the conversation already slipping from his shoulders as he donned the mask of the wealthy heir once more. But as he disappeared from view, she couldn't shake the feeling that their brief moment of connection had meant something to him, even if he didn't show it. After that day, Lola couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between her life and David's. While she woke up each day to the quiet, predictable routines of her humble home, David's life was one of constant pressure and high expectations. It seemed like no matter how much he tried to withdraw from it, the weight of his family's empire was always hanging over him. Despite his aloofness, Lola couldn't ignore the moments when he allowed himself to show a sliver of vulnerability. It was as if he was fighting a battle between the world he was born into and the person he truly wanted to be. But every time Lola thought she understood him a little better, there was always another wall to break through. One day, as she was walking to class, Lola saw David talking to a group of students by the entrance. It wasn't unusual to see him with people, but what struck her was the tension in his posture. His usual detached demeanor was replaced by a forced smile, and his body language screamed discomfort. As Lola approached, she overheard part of the conversation. "David, you need to get more involved with the upcoming gala. You know, it's important for your father's image." One of the girls, Rachel, said with a knowing smile. "Everyone's counting on you." David's smile faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "I know," he replied, his voice strained. "I'll be there." Lola could sense the reluctance in his words. It was clear that David wasn't just attending the gala out of his own desire to be part of the social scene. He was doing it because it was expected of him. Lola couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. While she had no desire for the glittering lifestyle the other students flaunted, she now realized that David didn't want it either. He was simply a pawn in a game he didn't choose to play. As she walked past the group, David's eyes met hers for a brief moment. His gaze was tired, and for a split second, Lola could see the depth of his internal struggle. She wanted to say something, to ask him how he was really feeling, but the words felt inadequate. Instead, she simply gave him a small, understanding smile. David nodded back, his lips twitching into a faint smile in return. The brief exchange left Lola with more questions than answers. She wanted to reach out, to offer him the comfort she knew he desperately needed. But she also knew that it wasn't that simple. David was not just a boy who could be easily rescued from his family's expectations. He had his own battles to fight, battles that no one could fully understand unless they had walked in his shoes. Later that day, as Lola sat in her history class, she found her thoughts drifting back to David. She couldn't stop wondering if there was more to his story, more to the weight he carried. She also realized that she was beginning to care for him, perhaps more than she had intended. There was something magnetic about him, something that drew her in despite the barriers he had built around himself. And yet, at the same time, she knew she couldn't let herself get too involved. She had her own dreams to pursue, and getting tangled in David's complicated world could lead to nothing but heartache. But as the days passed, Lola couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, they were both searching for something more, something beyond the roles they were expected to play. The week leading up to the school's annual gala felt like a blur. For Lola, it was a time of quiet reflection as she juggled her schoolwork and her growing confusion about her feelings for David. The gala was meant to be a glamorous event, an evening where the school's elite would flaunt their wealth and connections. But for Lola, it felt like another reminder of how different her life was from the world David inhabited. She had heard enough about the gala to know that it was going to be a grand affair. The students who were invited were expected to attend in their finest attire, and the event would be covered in the local media. Lola couldn't help but feel like an outsider. It wasn't just about the clothes or the spectacle of the evening. It was the underlying pressure that came with such an event. Everyone would be watching, everyone would be judging. To her surprise, David had been unusually quiet about the gala. She had expected him to be heavily involved, given his family's connections, but he seemed disinterested. He spoke little about it, almost as if he was dreading the event. One afternoon, as Lola sat in the school courtyard, David walked by with his usual entourage of friends. He seemed distracted, lost in thought, and his gaze flickered briefly in her direction. She wasn't sure if he had even noticed her, but before she could look away, David approached her. "Lola," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I need to talk to you about something." Lola looked up, a little surprised by his sudden approach. She had grown used to seeing David from a distance, always surrounded by others, so his direct attention felt like a rare privilege. "Sure," she said, putting down the book she had been reading. "What's up?" David glanced around quickly, as if making sure no one was listening. "The gala," he began, his voice low. "I don't want to go. It's complicated. and I don't think it's going to help anything." Lola was taken aback by his words. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep the confusion from her voice. "It's just a school event. Everyone's going. You don't have to enjoy it, but..." David interrupted her with a wave of his hand. "It's not about that. It's about my family, about the image they want to project. The gala's not just some fun party, it's a statement. And they want me to make that statement. They want me to play the part." Lola's heart sank as she listened to him. She had known that David's life was complicated, but hearing it like this, spoken with such quiet intensity, made the reality of his situation hit her even harder. He wasn't just struggling with his personal feelings. He was living under the suffocating pressure of his family's expectations. "I don't want to be a part of it," David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But if I don't show up, it'll cause problems. Big problems. I can't win either way." Lola wanted to reach out and comfort him, to tell him that he didn't have to do anything he didn't want to. But she also knew that David was caught in a web of his family's making, and there was no easy way out. For a moment, there was silence between them. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Lola found herself searching for something, anything to say that might help him. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," she said quietly, looking him directly in the eyes. "You don't have to do anything just because someone else expects it." David's gaze softened, but he shook his head. "It's not that simple, Lola. I wish it were." As the conversation ended, David turned to leave, his footsteps heavy as he walked away. Lola sat there, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on her. She couldn't help but feel a deep sadness for him. He was a prisoner of his own family's legacy, trapped in a world he didn't want, forced to play a role he hadn't chosen. But as she watched him disappear into the distance, a small part of her felt determined to be there for him. She might not be able to change his circumstances, but maybe, just maybe, she could offer him a little bit of the freedom he so desperately sought. The day of the gala arrived, and Lola couldn't shake the nervous energy that buzzed through her. She had never been to an event like this before, an evening where everything seemed so carefully curated and orchestrated. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a display of wealth, status, and power. For someone like Lola, who had grown up with modest means, it felt like stepping into a world she didn't quite belong in. She had decided not to attend the gala. She had no interest in the superficial glitter of the event, nor did she feel like she had any reason to be there. Besides, she had more important things on her mind. Her thoughts were consumed by David and the conversation they had the day before. She hadn't seen him since then, and she wondered how he was holding up. Lola had come to realize that David wasn't just someone who could be saved with a few kind words. His struggles ran deeper than she had first understood. He was caught in a tug-of-war between his own desires and the weight of his family's expectations. She could see how much he wanted out, but at the same time, she knew that escaping his legacy wasn't a choice he could easily make. As the night wore on, Lola sat in her small room at home, her phone buzzing with updates from friends who were attending the gala. She couldn't help but scroll through the photos, seeing the familiar faces of the elite students in their glamorous outfits. But it was one picture in particular that caught her attention. A photo of David standing with his family in front of the glittering backdrop of the event. His expression was unreadable, but his posture seemed stiff, as if he was forcing himself to smile. Lola's heart ached as she looked at the image. She knew that behind that smile, David was struggling. It wasn't just the pressure of being at the gala. It was the constant weight of expectations that shaped every aspect of his life. She couldn't help but wonder if he felt trapped in the very life he had been born into, unable to break free from the chains of his family's empire. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a message from Clara, one of David's classmates. "Hey Lola, you should have come to the gala. It was so much fun. David was looking so good tonight. You should have seen him." Lola felt a pang of discomfort at the message. It wasn't that Clara was wrong. David had always been a handsome guy, effortlessly charming in his own way. But Lola couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's words were more about the spectacle than anything meaningful. Still, Lola didn't respond. She knew that her own feelings for David were becoming more complicated by the day. She wasn't sure if it was admiration or something deeper, but it was clear that her connection to him was growing stronger. It made her question her place in his life and whether there was room for someone like her in his world. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. Later that evening, as the night grew late, Lola found herself restless. She couldn't sleep. The image of David standing with his family kept replaying in her mind. It was as if she could feel the weight of his life pressing against her, even from afar. She knew that despite the glamour of the event, David was still struggling with something much more profound. He had no control over his life, and the facade he was putting on was only making things worse. In a moment of impulse, Lola grabbed her phone and sent him a text. It was simple, but it felt important. "I hope you're okay," she wrote. "You don't have to do this alone." It was the first time she had reached out to him since their conversation in the courtyard. She wasn't sure if he would respond or even see it, but something told her that he needed to hear it. He needed to know that someone cared about him, even if he couldn't express it. As Lola set her phone down and finally tried to get some rest, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't sure what would happen next with David, or even what the future held for them. But one thing was clear: she wasn't going to back away. Not now. Not when he needed someone to stand by him. The days following the gala were a blur of mixed emotions for Lola. The pictures, the posts, the gossip, all of it had faded into the background of her mind. But the text she sent to David lingered, and she found herself checking her phone repeatedly, hoping for a response. But none came. At first, she was disappointed. Then, as the silence continued, she started to wonder if she had overstepped in some way. Maybe he didn't want to hear from her, or maybe her message had been too personal, too vulnerable. Despite the uncertainty, Lola couldn't push the thoughts of David out of her mind. Every time she saw him in the halls, her heart would race, and she couldn't help but notice how he still wore that mask, detached, almost robotic, as if nothing in the world could truly affect him. But Lola knew better now. She knew that there was so much more beneath the surface. A week after the gala, Lola found herself walking to class when she spotted David sitting by the school's front steps, his laptop open in front of him. He was engrossed in something, but when Lola passed by, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. "Lola," David said finally, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Hey," she responded, stopping her tracks. "How's everything?" David gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. Same old," he said. "You?" Lola could tell he was trying to be casual, but his usual nonchalance was slipping. There was something different about the way he looked at her now, a softness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "I'm good," Lola replied, glancing down at the laptop in front of him. "What are you working on?" David hesitated, then pushed the laptop aside. "Just some things for school. You know how it is." Lola nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. There was something he wasn't saying, and she could feel it. She remembered the conversation they had before the gala, how he had seemed so distant and troubled. That memory stuck with her, and for the first time, she decided to address it. "David," she began, her voice gentle, "I know you've been dealing with a lot. You don't have to hide it from me. I just want you to know you don't have to carry everything on your own." David's expression faltered for a moment, and Lola could see the internal struggle playing out in his eyes. It was clear that he was wrestling with something deep inside. But before he could respond, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. A group of students walked by, chatting and laughing, and David quickly straightened up, putting on his usual mask of indifference. I appreciate that, Lola," he said, his voice stiff, as if he were trying to regain control of the conversation. "But I've got it covered." Lola could tell that he wasn't being entirely honest. She didn't push him, though. She understood that some things couldn't be forced. But she also knew that this was a moment of vulnerability for him, one that he wasn't yet ready to fully embrace. As the group of students moved on, David stood up, gathering his things. "I should get going," he said quickly. "I'll see you around." Lola watched him walk away, the familiar distance returning between them. But something had shifted. She had reached him in a way that she hadn't before. And while she wasn't sure where things would go, she knew that their connection was real, even if it was still fragile. Later that evening, Lola received a text. She stared at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw David's name. "Thanks for reaching out earlier. I needed to hear it. I just don't know how to deal with everything right now. But I'll get there." Lola smiled to herself, feeling a rush of relief wash over her. It wasn't much, but it was enough. David was starting to open up, even if just a little. And that, to her, was a sign that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for both of them. The days that followed the text from David were filled with a quiet anticipation for Lola. She couldn't stop thinking about their conversation on the steps and the way he had opened up, even if only a little. It was more than she had ever expected, and it left her with a sense of warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold walls David had built around himself. Lola had always been the kind of person to go after what she wanted, to chase after her dreams without hesitation. But with David, she felt like she was navigating uncharted territory. She didn't know the rules, nor was she sure if there were any at all. But one thing was clear: every interaction with him, no matter how small, felt important. It was as if every word they exchanged brought them closer, though she knew they both had a long way to go. It was during their next encounter, a few days after the brief exchange on the steps, that things started to shift even further. Lola had been walking across the school courtyard, lost in thought about an upcoming exam, when she spotted David sitting alone on one of the benches. His head was down, and his fingers were running through his hair as he scrolled through his phone. Lola had been hesitant to approach him, not wanting to intrude on his space, but something inside her urged her to go. "Hey, David," she called softly, approaching him with a tentative smile. David looked up, startled for a moment, but then the surprise quickly faded into something more neutral. He straightened up and gestured to the empty spot next to him. "Hey, Lola, you're not busy?" Lola shook her head, sitting down beside him. "Nope, just avoiding my homework for a bit." She laughed lightly, but David didn't respond in his usual dry way. Instead, there was a hint of something else in his eyes, something more vulnerable, more real. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," David said after a pause, his voice quieter than usual. "And I realized that maybe I've been shutting people out for too long." Lola was caught off guard by his admission. She wasn't sure what to say. She had been expecting more of the same. His usual deflection, his careful detachment. But this was different. David was opening up, and for once Lola didn't feel like she had to do all the work to keep the conversation going. "I get it," she said softly, her voice gentle. "You've been through a lot, David. And sometimes it's easier to push people away than to face everything head on." David nodded, his gaze shifting to the ground as he seemed to reflect on her words. "I don't want to be the guy who pushes everyone away," he admitted, his voice laced with regret. "But it's hard. My family, they want me to be something I'm not. They expect me to follow a certain path, but it's not what I want. I don't even know what I want anymore." Lola could hear the pain in his voice. She had always known that David's life was complicated, but hearing him speak so openly about his struggles made her heart ache. She wanted to reach out, to tell him that it was okay to feel lost, to not have all the answers. But she knew that wasn't what David needed right now. What he needed was someone who would listen without judgment, someone who wouldn't try to fix everything. "You don't have to have it all figured out," Lola said quietly. "Life doesn't always give us clear answers, but it's okay to not know what comes next. You don't have to carry that burden on your own, either." For a long moment, there was only silence between them, the weight of their words hanging in the air. Then, David looked up at her, his expression softer than it had ever been before. It was a look of quiet gratitude, as though he was finally beginning to understand that Lola wasn't trying to change him. She was just there to be with him, in whatever way he needed. "Thanks, Lola," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I would have done without someone like you." Lola's heart fluttered at his words, but she quickly pushed aside the surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. She wasn't there to be his savior. She was there as a friend, as someone who cared. That was enough for her. As they sat there, the conversation slowly shifted to lighter topics: homework, school projects, and the upcoming break. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They had crossed a line, from mere acquaintances to something deeper, something more real. And though neither of them said it out loud, both knew that their connection was growing in a way neither had expected. As they parted ways later, David gave her a brief smile, one that was genuine, unguarded, and full of promise. Lola couldn't help but smile back, her heart beating just a little faster. She wasn't sure where things were headed, but for the first time, she felt like they were both on the same path, walking towards something unknown but undeniably real.